Dr. Gabriel will close us out, and then we'll probably kick it back. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I am, and we are, my colleague and I are honored to be working with you on this project. We come from Pittsburgh, which has 30-some or more years of working with innovation clusters from way back, and I see Bob Gittler here originally from the Ben Franklin program in Pennsylvania. Mostly out of necessity. I mean, our history is very different, but it's surprising how some things are the same between our community and yours. And we're here because we bring some experience, but also a window on trying to connect the things that you're doing here with best practices around the country. As you all know, in Pittsburgh, 30-some more years ago, we lost lots of jobs, more than almost 200,000 jobs in the steel and metal bashing industries. And even though we don't make steel anymore, we actually still have a pretty strong steel supply chain cluster. And so that's actually still thriving, amazingly enough. But anyway, we've tried all the things. We've tried the war among the states. We did infotech and biotech and nanotech, and we've done all of our clusters, robotics, and some of them have been successful and some of them less so. And I think we've learned over time what seems to work and what doesn't. More than a decade ago, Teresa Hines Carey, who is the chair of the board of the Hines Endowments, where I've spent the last 4 or so years, recognized that the future of Pittsburgh was the knowledge economy, which is very much the same as what you have here. Not federal agencies, but really our eds and meds, the research universities and hospitals. And she recognized that that's really, even though a lot of people wanted to do very standard community development, nonprofits on the ground, which we all do, how do you connect that kind of an effort with the fast-growing parts of the economy? How do you have an economically driven agenda while still having a people-centered agenda? And so we discovered, so she invited me in. I have a sort of a technology background. I did a lot of work you can read my career, but it's all about research, tech transfer, regional economic development, how do you do regional clusters, and I've been involved with a lot of these cluster initiatives. But one of the things that we noticed in working with foundation dollars is that philanthropy can really be kind of a venture capital for these things. We can try little pilot projects on the ground that connect the dots and start things on a small scale and work with nonprofits and work with community organizations who understand the ground truth of what's happening in some of the communities that matter. And what we noticed in Pittsburgh is that while we were beginning to get some very successful clusters, they were beginning to aggregate where there were already amenities and already other clusters. I mean, if you think about it, clusters themselves tend to cluster. And so what you see is you have very, very high growth regions that keep growing and growing and getting more and more crowded. Then other parts of the region that really nothing's happening. And if you look at a map of the Washington metro region, you see beautiful, amazing growth. It may not feel like it because of the economic downturn, but the data show that this part of the country is actually the fastest job creator in the nation. So, I'm sure it doesn't feel like it to most people because it's a relative scale, but you're actually doing really well here, and there's an awful lot of growth. So how do we make sure that growth, in this moment of growth, what can we be doing to make sure that the region around St. Elizabeth's, which really needs some attention on trying to help make sure that this community gets revitalized, what can we be doing with the community? What we discovered in Pittsburgh was that often the communities that are most economically distressed are sitting right next to the communities that are experiencing high growth. And if you look through the history of how did this community become distressed in the first place, it turns out that in some of the communities in Pittsburgh, it was 50 years ago, a failed federal policy of urban renewal, where you could get a federal subsidy to bulldoze that community and get rid of what was the blight, what people called blight, and that community is still economically distressed today, mostly because of just that sort of brutal, essentially attack on the networks and the social networks and the business networks of that community. So that's where we started, and we realized in the foundation community, which tends to be downtown in nice offices with highly trained Ivy League degreed professionals, that we weren't going to be able to figure out what to do unless we began hiring people who hail from those communities, who live in those communities and work in those communities, grew up in those communities, and have lived and worked the issues that these communities face after decades and decades and decades of distress. And so you'll see when we began hiring folks from the community, we began to have better and better and more interesting ideas, and we began to work much more closely in partnership with organizations organizations on the ground in those communities, and we began to get some traction on how to connect the high-growth clusters with what's really needed in some of these communities. So we are honored to be working with all of you, and as Harriet pointed out, some of the exact same issues are happening here in this region, and I think we can all work together as a region. Regional Innovation Clusters, it's about region. It's about we're all in this together. What are we good at, and how can we all contribute to making it better? So thank you all for coming. I'm really anxious to meet all of you and look forward to working with you.